The first time Caleb Hartley saw the woman standing at the edge of his ranch road, he thought she was lost, foolish, or both. Nobody walked out here alone, not with the sun dropping behind the mesas and the wind dragging dust across the flats like a warning. He slowed his horse but didn't dismount, studying her the way a man studies a storm he hopes will pass without touching his land. She wore a faded blue dress that had once been neat, now marked with travel and trouble, and a hat that sat too carefully on her head for someone who truly belonged to the wild. In her hand was a worn leather bag, the kind people carried when they had nowhere else to leave their things. Caleb tipped his hat just enough to be polite and asked if she was waiting for someone. She looked up at him with eyes that held more steadiness than fear and said she was waiting for work. He almost laughed then, not out of cruelty but out of disbelief, because there was no work here for a woman who didn't know cattle from coyotes. The ranch barely held together as it was. Still, she didn't move when he told her so. She simply stood there, as if the wind and the dust and his doubt were things she had already decided to outlast. Her name was Eliza Moore, and she spoke it plainly, without apology or hesitation. She said she could cook, mend, clean, and keep books if he had them. Caleb told her he had beans, a broken fence, and a temper, and none of those required a bookkeeper. He expected that to send her walking back toward whatever town had pushed her out, but she only shifted the bag from one hand to the other and said she would sleep in the barn if she had to. There was something in the way she said it that made him uncomfortable, not because it was defiant, but because it was certain. Caleb had lived alone long enough to distrust certainty in others. Certainty meant expectations, and expectations meant disappointment. He told her she could stay one night, no longer, and only because the coyotes were loud already and he wasn't the kind of man who let someone get eaten just to prove a point. She thanked him as if he had offered her a palace. That night, he watched from the doorway as she sat on an overturned crate in the barn, eating the same beans he had eaten for weeks without complaint. Most people asked questions when they arrived at his ranch: how much land, how many cattle, how far to the nearest town, but Eliza asked nothing. She simply ate, then pulled a needle and thread from her bag and began repairing a tear in her sleeve with small, careful stitches. Caleb told himself she would be gone by morning. People always were, but morning came, and she was still there, sweeping the barn floor with a broken broom she had found behind the tack room. She moved slowly, not out of laziness but because she was learning the shape of the place, the way a person learns a language by listening first. Caleb told her she was wasting her time. She told him a clean barn kept sickness away. He told her sickness came whether the floor was clean or not. She said maybe, but it didn't hurt to try. He rode out to check the south fence, expecting that when he returned she would have grown bored and left. Instead, he found the water trough scrubbed, the tack hung in order, and a pot simmering over the fire with something that smelled better than anything he had tasted in months. He told her it didn't change anything. She nodded and handed him a bowl. Days passed like that, each one another small argument between his resistance and her persistence. She never asked to be paid. She never asked how long she could stay. She simply worked, quietly, steadily, as if she had always belonged to the rhythm of the ranch. Caleb found himself speaking more than he meant to, offering brief instructions, then longer ones, then stories he hadn't told anyone in years. He told her about the drought that had taken half his herd, about the partner who had left for California, about the letter from the bank that sat unopened on his table because he already knew what it would say. Eliza listened without trying to fix anything. That, more than her work, was what unsettled him. One evening, a storm rolled in fast, the kind that turned the sky green and made the horses restless. Caleb rushed to secure the gate, expecting to find Eliza inside, but she was in the pasture, struggling to guide a frightened mare toward the shelter. The wind nearly knocked her over, but she didn't let go of the rope. Caleb swore and ran to help, anger flaring not at her but at the danger she had put herself in. When they finally got the mare inside, he told her she had no business being out there. She looked at him, soaked and shivering, and said the mare would have broken a leg if she'd panicked. It was the first time he realized she wasn't trying to prove herself to him. She was simply doing what needed to be done. After that, something shifted. He still told himself she was temporary, that she would leave as soon as she found a better place, but he began setting aside a portion of whatever money he made from selling calves, calling it supplies but knowing it was for her. He fixed the loose board in the small room off the kitchen and pretended it had always been meant for someone else. Eliza moved her bag there without ceremony, placing it in the corner as if she were careful not to take up too much space. The ranch began to change in ways Caleb didn't want to admit. Meals had flavor. The ledger he had ignored for months was organized, showing him exactly how close he was to losing everything and exactly what he might do to prevent it. The garden behind the house, long dead, showed the first green shoots of beans and onions. Even the horses seemed calmer. Caleb told himself it was coincidence. One afternoon, a trader passing through stopped to buy water and asked if Caleb had hired a housekeeper. Caleb almost said no, that she was just passing through, but Eliza stepped forward and negotiated a fair price for a sack of flour he hadn't realized they needed. The trader left, and Caleb realized he had just witnessed someone fighting for his survival as if it were her own. He asked her why. She shrugged and said she liked the way the land looked at sunrise. That night, he laughed at something she said, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't heard from himself in years, and the sound surprised them both. It felt like a crack in a wall he had built carefully, brick by brick, after losing everything that had once made him hopeful. He tried to close that crack the next morning by reminding her she was still only staying temporarily. She nodded, but she didn't pack. Weeks turned into a month. The bank letter was finally opened, and instead of despair, Caleb and Eliza sat at the table making plans. Sell 2 horses, repair the north fence, plant more beans, cut costs where they could. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a direction, and direction was something Caleb had been missing longer than he cared to admit. One evening, as the sun burned low and the sky turned the color of old copper, Caleb realized he no longer watched the road expecting her to leave. Instead, he watched it hoping she would return quickly whenever she went to gather herbs near the creek. The thought unsettled him more than anything else had. He told himself it was practicality. The ranch ran better with her there. That was all. But when a group of riders appeared on the horizon one afternoon, men he recognized as cattle buyers with a reputation for buying cheap and pushing hard, Caleb felt a flicker of fear, not for his land, but for her. He told her to stay inside while he spoke to them. She refused, standing beside him with the quiet steadiness that had first brought her to his gate. The men made jokes, asked if she came with the property, laughed in the way men do when they think something belongs to them simply because they can see it. Caleb felt his hands curl into fists. Before he could speak, Eliza answered their questions with calm, sharp intelligence, turning their jokes into business, their assumptions into mistakes. They left with a fair deal that kept the ranch afloat for another season. After they were gone, Caleb realized he had stopped seeing her as someone who needed shelter. She had become someone who provided it. That night, he sat on the porch while she watered the garden, and he understood that the joke he had made in his mind the day she arrived, that she wouldn't last a week, had long since stopped being funny. She had stayed, not because he had asked, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had chosen to stand beside him in a place most people would have abandoned. And for the first time since the drought, Caleb allowed himself to believe that the ranch, and perhaps his own heart, might survive. Caleb had always believed that trouble announced itself with dust on the horizon and the sound of hooves moving too fast. He did not expect it to arrive quietly, folded into a letter with a city seal and Eliza's name written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. The envelope came with the supply wagon from town, passed to him without comment, as if it were nothing more than a receipt or a bill. He nearly set it aside with the others, but the way Eliza froze when she saw it told him this was something different. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she placed it on the table, smoothed the edge with her fingers, and went about preparing supper with a silence that felt heavier than any storm. Caleb told himself it was none of his business. They had never spoken about where she came from, and he had never asked. Whatever life she had before the ranch belonged to her alone. But when she finally broke the seal and read the contents, the color drained from her face so quickly that he stood without thinking. She folded the letter once, then again, until it was small enough to hide in her palm. "It's nothing," she said, but her voice had lost its steady rhythm. He did not press her. He simply nodded and stepped outside, giving her the space he believed she needed, though every instinct told him that whatever was written there would change something between them. Over the next few days, the ranch continued its routine, but the ease that had settled between them was gone. Eliza worked harder than ever, as if effort alone could outpace whatever shadow followed her. She woke before dawn, took on the heaviest chores, and spoke only when necessary. Caleb tried to pretend he did not notice, but the quiet pressed against him. He had grown used to the small sounds she brought with her, the soft humming while she cooked, the measured turning of pages as she updated the ledger, the occasional laugh when one of the chickens did something foolish. Without those sounds, the house felt as empty as it had before she arrived. On the fourth morning after the letter came, Caleb found her in the barn, packing her bag with the same careful movements he remembered from the day she first arrived. He leaned against the doorway and asked if she had found work elsewhere. She hesitated, then said she had received news that required her to return east. She would leave by noon. The words were calm, but they struck him harder than he expected. He told himself he had known this would happen eventually, that she had always been temporary, but knowing did not make it easier. He nodded, told her he wished her well, and stepped aside so she could pass. She did not move. Instead, she looked at him with the same steady gaze she had held the first day, but now there was something else beneath it, fear, not for herself, but for him. She handed him the letter. He took it slowly, unsure whether he had the right to read it, but she did not take it back. The words were direct and cold, written by a man who claimed to be her brother. Their father had died, leaving debts tied to the family name. Creditors were looking for her, and if she did not return to settle matters, they would pursue legal action that could extend to anyone providing her shelter. The ranch, Caleb realized, was not just land anymore. It was risk. He looked up, expecting her to say she was leaving to protect him, but instead she said she had no intention of going back. The life she had left behind was one of control and expectation, of decisions made for her by men who believed her future was an asset to be traded. She had walked away with nothing but the bag she carried, choosing uncertainty over a life that was already planned. The letter was not a summons, it was a threat, and now that threat had found its way to the one place she had allowed herself to belong. Caleb felt anger rise, not at her, but at the unseen forces that believed they could reach into his home and claim authority. He told her she could stay. She argued that doing so would endanger him, that the bank was already watching his accounts, that one legal claim could tip the balance and cost him everything. He answered that everything had nearly been lost before she arrived, and if he had to fight to keep it now, he would not fight alone. It was the first time he had spoken of the ranch as something they shared. The following week brought tension neither of them had known before. Caleb rode into town more often, speaking with the bank, selling 2 of his strongest horses to raise cash, and securing written agreements that made it harder for outside claims to attach themselves to his property. Eliza handled the books with renewed urgency, finding savings he had overlooked, negotiating with suppliers, and turning the small garden into a source of trade rather than just food. They moved like partners in a quiet war, each protecting the other without speaking the fear that hung over them. Then the riders came. They were not cattle buyers this time. Their clothes were too fine for that, their horses too well fed, their eyes too sharp. They carried documents instead of ropes and spoke in the language of law rather than commerce. They asked for Eliza more by name. Caleb stepped between them and the house, telling them she did not live there. It was a lie, and they knew it. They produced a paper bearing a seal and spoke of debts, obligations, and the consequences of harboring someone who refused to answer legal claims. Caleb listened without removing his hand from the gate latch, blocking their path as surely as if he held a rifle. Eliza came to the doorway before he could stop her. She did not hide. She stood straight, the wind catching the edge of her dress, and told the men she would not return with them. They warned her that refusal would lead to court action, to seizure of assets, to public notice that would follow her wherever she went. She answered that she owned nothing they could take except her labor, and that labor was already given. The men looked at Caleb, measuring him, calculating whether he was worth the trouble. He met their gaze with a steadiness that surprised even himself. After a long moment, they left, not defeated but delayed, promising to return with greater authority. That night, Caleb and Eliza sat at the table with the lantern burning low. The ranch, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt like a line drawn in the dirt. He told her she could still go if she wanted to spare him the fight. She told him she had already run once and would not run again. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a decision forming. Days turned into a preparation for something neither of them fully understood. Caleb repaired the perimeter fences not just for cattle, but as a statement of boundary. Eliza organized every document related to the ranch, creating a record that proved ownership and independence. They spoke of the future in practical terms: crop yields, livestock numbers, market prices, but beneath those conversations was a shared recognition that whatever came next would bind their lives together more tightly than any spoken promise. One evening, as they finished stacking hay in the barn, Eliza slipped on the ladder and would have fallen if Caleb had not caught her. For a moment, they stood too close, the weight of unspoken things between them. He realized then that what he felt was no longer just gratitude or partnership. It was something deeper, something that made the idea of her leaving feel like a physical loss. He stepped back first, not because he wanted distance, but because he feared what closeness might demand. The next morning, a notice arrived from the bank approving a revised loan based on the ranch's improved productivity. It was proof that their work had value beyond survival. Caleb handed the paper to Eliza without comment, but she understood what it meant. They had built something that could withstand more than drought. But trouble was patient. 2 weeks later, a marshal rode onto the property with a court order requiring Eliza to appear in town to address the claims against her. It was not an arrest, but it carried the weight of law. Caleb argued that the ranch needed her, that removing her would cause financial harm. The marshal replied that the law did not measure value in the same way as a ledger. Eliza placed a hand on Caleb's arm and said she would go. Not to surrender, but to face what had followed her. As she prepared to leave, Caleb felt the same hollow certainty he had felt the day she first stood on his road, the belief that once she walked away, she would not return. This time, he did not hide behind indifference. He told her the ranch would not be the same without her. She answered that she had not come there to change the land. She had come to change herself, and in doing so, had changed both of them. When she climbed into the wagon that would take her to town, she did not look back immediately. She waited until the horses had begun to move, then turned, meeting his eyes across the distance. There was no fear in her expression now, only resolve. Caleb watched until the wagon disappeared beyond the rise, the dust settling slowly in its wake. The ranch stood quiet around him, the garden green, the fences strong, the ledger balanced. Everything they had built remained. But for the first time since she arrived, it felt like survival might not be enough. The town courthouse was smaller than Caleb remembered, but it carried the same weight it always had, the sense that lives could be measured and divided within its walls by people who had never touched the dust of the land those lives depended on. He had ridden through the night to reach it, arriving with the sunrise and the ache of a decision he could no longer postpone. For years he had avoided places like this, believing that survival came from distance, from keeping his world small enough that no one could reach into it and change the rules. But Eliza had already changed the rules simply by refusing to leave. She stood on the courthouse steps when he arrived, speaking with a man in a dark coat who held a stack of papers bound in red string. She looked tired but unafraid, her posture straight, her hands steady. When she saw Caleb, something in her expression softened, not into relief but into recognition, as if she had known he would come even when he had not known it himself. He dismounted and approached, ignoring the curious looks of townspeople who had never seen him anywhere but the edges of the cattle market. The man with the papers introduced himself as the attorney representing her family's creditors and began to speak in the language of obligations and recoveries. Caleb listened only long enough to understand that they were not here for justice but for leverage. Inside, the courtroom was crowded with the quiet murmur of people who treated other lives as a form of entertainment. Eliza took her place at the front, answering questions with calm clarity. She did not deny the debts tied to her father's name, but she refused the assumption that she was responsible for them. She spoke of the years she had spent being told what her future would be, of the arrangements made without her consent, of the expectation that she would marry to settle accounts she had never created. The judge listened with a measured expression that revealed nothing. The attorney countered with documents, with signatures, with the cold logic of inheritance. Caleb sat in the back, his hands resting on his knees, feeling more helpless than he ever had on the open range. Out there, problems could be solved with fences, with water, with patience. Here, everything depended on words and the willingness of strangers to believe them. When Eliza finished speaking, the room fell into a brief silence that seemed to stretch longer than it truly did. Then the attorney turned the argument toward the ranch. He spoke of harboring, of shared assets, of the possibility that Eliza's labor could be considered part of Caleb's income and therefore subject to claim. It was a reach, but it was a dangerous one. Caleb felt the old instinct to withdraw, to protect what was his by denying any connection beyond employment. He could say she was only a worker, that she had no claim to the ranch and the ranch had no claim to her. It would be the easiest path, the safest for his land. He looked at her. She did not look back, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she had prepared herself for the possibility that he might choose survival over loyalty. In that moment, Caleb understood that the ranch had already changed hands in the only way that mattered. It was no longer just a place he owned. It was a place they had built. When the judge asked if Caleb Hartley wished to make a statement regarding the nature of Eliza Moore's presence on his property, he stood. His voice was rough from the ride and from years of disuse in rooms like this, but it did not shake. He said she was not an employee in the way the attorney suggested. She was his partner in the operation of the ranch, responsible for its financial recovery and daily management. Her work had increased its value, not as an asset to be seized but as evidence of shared effort. He presented the revised loan agreement, the ledgers she had organized, the contracts she had negotiated. He spoke not in legal language but in the plain terms of work and result, of drought survived and debt reduced, of land that had gone from failing to productive because two people had chosen to stand on it together. The courtroom shifted, the murmurs changing tone. The attorney attempted to object, arguing that partnership implied liability, that if Eliza was a partner then her obligations extended to the ranch. Caleb answered before the judge could rule. He said that if liability was to be assigned, it should follow the truth of labor and decision. The debts in question were tied to a family enterprise Eliza had left and from which she had received nothing. The ranch had no connection to that enterprise and had been built independently. To claim otherwise would be to punish someone for the act of leaving a situation they had no control over. It was not a perfect argument, but it was an honest one. The judge recessed briefly to review the documents. When he returned, his decision was measured and precise. Eliza was not legally responsible for the debts beyond any personal assets she held at the time of her father's death, which were none. The attempt to attach those debts to the ranch was unsupported by evidence of financial integration prior to the date of her arrival. However, the judge warned that any formal partnership would require proper registration if it were to be recognized in future disputes. The gavel struck, and just like that, the threat that had followed her across the miles lost its legal weight. Outside, the sunlight felt different, brighter than it had that morning. Eliza stood on the steps, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. Caleb joined her, unsure of what to say now that the fight had moved from fear to possibility. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the town moving around them. "You didn't have to do that," she said at last. "Yes, I did," he answered, and the simplicity of the words surprised them both. They rode back to the ranch together, not speaking much, the distance feeling shorter than it ever had. When the buildings came into view, the garden green and the fences straight, Eliza slowed her horse and looked across the land as if seeing it for the first time. Caleb realized that for all the work they had done, they had never truly decided what they were to each other beyond necessity. He dismounted near the porch and turned to her with a nervousness that felt more dangerous than any storm. He told her that when she first arrived, he had thought of her as a problem that would solve itself by leaving. Then he had thought of her as help. Then as a partner. Somewhere along the way, she had become the reason the ranch mattered at all. He did not know how to speak in promises or plans beyond the next season, but he knew he did not want a future that did not include her. Eliza listened without interrupting. When he finished, she smiled in a way he had only seen a few times before, a smile that carried both warmth and decision. She said she had stayed not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had found something worth building. She had been prepared to leave to protect him, and she had been prepared to stand alone in that courtroom if he chose the ranch over her. The fact that he had chosen both changed everything. They did not mark the moment with grand gestures. There was no dramatic embrace, no declarations meant for an audience. Instead, they walked into the house together and sat at the table where they had first planned how to survive. This time, the ledger lay open not as a record of debt but as a map of possibility. They spoke of registering the partnership properly, of expanding the garden, of hiring seasonal help, of building a second small house near the creek. Each plan was practical, grounded in the same steady work that had brought them this far. That evening, as the sun lowered and the sky turned to copper once more, Caleb found himself laughing at something small, a chicken escaping the pen, a detail in the ledger that Eliza had annotated with a dry remark. The laugh was different from the one he had given on the day she arrived. It was no longer a shield against uncertainty. It was an acceptance of it. He realized then that the joke he had once made in his mind, that she would never last, that she would leave like everyone else, had become the story he would tell about the moment everything changed. Not because it was funny, but because it marked the distance between who he had been and who he had chosen to become. Eliza stepped onto the porch beside him, their shoulders nearly touching, both looking out over the land that had tested them and held them. The wind moved through the grass in slow waves, carrying the scent of soil and growth rather than dust. The ranch was still fragile in the ways all things are fragile, dependent on rain, on markets, on the unpredictable turns of fortune. But it was no longer something he faced alone. For the first time, Caleb understood that survival was not the highest measure of a life. Standing beside someone who refused to walk away, that was. And when she reached for his hand, he did not hesitate.